Beneath the rolling hills of Arundel County, in the tobacco fields of colonial Maryland, lies a secret so disturbing that the Catholic Church has spent over 2 centuries trying to erase it from history. Across the colony, between 1734 and 1768, 12 parishes fell under the control of a family whose name still makes elderly parishioners cross themselves in fear. The Thornton family didn't just serve God. They played him, manipulating the sacred act of confession to build an empire of terror that would make modern organized crime seem like child's play. What you're about to hear has been pieced together from sealed church archives, from coded journals discovered in a Maryland farmhouse wall in 1892, and from testimonies suppressed for nearly 3 centuries. This isn't just another tale of religious corruption. This is the story of how 3 men used the confessional booth to control an entire colony through blackmail, through poison, and through the most twisted abuse of sacred trust ever documented in American history. Before we continue with the story of the Thornton family and their web of ecclesiastical terror, I need to ask you something. This channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the dark secrets that history tried to bury. If you're one of the few people brave enough to hear these forbidden tales, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And I'm curious, drop a comment below telling me what state or city you're listening from. Are you brave enough to let us know where you are as we dive into this nightmare together? Now, let's return to Maryland. To the year 1734, where evil wore a priest's collar. The autumn of 1734 found colonial Maryland in a precarious position between Protestant and Catholic tensions, a religious battleground where the Calvert family's Catholic influence still held sway despite growing Anglican pressure. In this volatile atmosphere, the small port town of Havenwood, nestled along the Severn River about 20 miles southeast of Annapolis, represented everything the Catholic Church was fighting to preserve in the New World. Havenwood wasn't large by colonial standards, perhaps 800 souls spread across tobacco plantations and the modest businesses that served them. But what it lacked in size, it made up for in influence. The town's Catholic families controlled much of the tobacco trade flowing through the Chesapeake Bay, their names appearing on shipping manifests that reached from London to the Caribbean. The Curthus owned 3 plantations and a fleet of merchant vessels. The Whitmore family controlled the largest tobacco warehouse between Baltimore and Annapolis. The Ashfords had built their fortune on both tobacco and the less discussed but highly profitable slave trade. At the heart of this Catholic enclave stood St. Bartholomew's Church, a modest brick structure whose bell tower could be seen from ships entering the Severn River. Unlike the grand cathedrals of Europe, St. Bartholomew reflected the practical sensibilities of colonial architecture. Sturdy oak pews, plain glass windows, and thick walls designed to withstand both Maryland's humid summers and the occasional raid by pirates who still prowled the Chesapeake. But it was what lay within those walls that would make Street Bartholomew infamous. In the late summer of 1734, Father Thomas Thornton arrived to serve as the parish priest, bringing with him an unusual request. He wanted to install new confessional booths, not just 1 or 2, but 4 elaborately constructed wooden chambers that he claimed would better serve the spiritual needs of his growing congregation. Father Thornton was not what most parishioners expected in a priest. Tall and imposing at nearly 6 feet, with prematurely grey hair and piercing blue eyes, he possessed an intelligence that seemed almost predatory. He spoke with the refined accent of someone educated in European seminaries, yet there was something in his manner that suggested he understood the crude realities of colonial life better than most men of the cloth. When he smiled, which he did often during those first months, it never quite reached his eyes. What the parishioners of St. Bartholomew didn't know was that Father Thornton had spent the previous 5 years traveling throughout Maryland, visiting Catholic parishes and taking careful note of their wealthiest and most influential members. He had studied their business dealings, their family connections, their strengths, and most importantly, their potential vulnerabilities. He hadn't come to Havenwood to save souls. He had come to harvest secrets. The confessional booths that Father Thornton installed were masterpieces of deceptive craftsmanship, built by his nephew Marcus, a skilled carpenter who had supposedly learned his trade in Philadelphia. Each booth appeared to be a standard 3-chambered confessional, a central compartment for the priest flanked by 2 kneeling chambers for penitents. The dark oak construction and intricate carved crosses gave them an air of sacred solemnity that impressed even the wealthiest parishioners. But hidden within the walls of each confessional was an innovation that would have horrified the faithful had they discovered it. Marcus Thornton had constructed a series of hollow metal tubes that ran from each penitent chamber to a concealed recording chamber beneath the church. These tubes, crafted from tin and carefully angled to carry sound without distortion, allowed every whispered confession to be heard and recorded in the basement below. The recording system itself was ingeniously simple. The metal tubes fed into small echo chambers lined with curved metal surfaces that amplified sound. A person positioned in the basement chamber could hear conversations from the confessionals above with startling clarity. But Father Thornton went one step further. He trained his younger nephew Samuel to transcribe these conversations using a cipher of his own devising, creating permanent records of every confession made in St. Bartholomew's. The first victim of the Thornton family's scheme revealed himself on a cold February morning in 1735, though he had no idea he was walking into a trap that had been 6 months in the making. Richard Whitmore entered St. Bartholomew's that Tuesday morning, carrying a burden that had been eating at him for weeks. As one of Havenwood's most successful tobacco merchants, Whitmore was known throughout the colony for his strict adherence to Catholic doctrine and his generous donations to the church. His reputation was built on integrity, on fair dealing, and on the kind of moral rectitude that made other merchants seek him out as a business partner. But Richard Whitmore had a secret that would have destroyed everything he had built. 3 months earlier, while conducting business in Annapolis, Whitmore had encountered a young woman named Catherine Mills, an indentured servant who worked in the tavern where he often stayed during business trips. Catherine was 19, beautiful in the way that made men forget their vows, and trapped in an indenture contract that wouldn't expire for another 4 years. What began as casual conversation had led to something that Catholic doctrine considered one of the gravest sins: adultery. As Whitmore knelt in the confessional that February morning, his voice barely above a whisper, he poured out his guilt to Father Thornton. He spoke of his shame, of his betrayal of his wife Margaret, of his violation of his sacred marriage vows. He described his ongoing relationship with Catherine, his plans to purchase her indenture contract, and his terror that the affair would be discovered and destroy his family's reputation. Father Thornton listened with the practiced compassion of a confessor, offering words of comfort and assuring Whitmore that God's forgiveness was available to all who truly repented. He prescribed a penance of prayers and charitable donations, then blessed Whitmore as the merchant left the confessional with tears of relief streaming down his face. But in the basement beneath St. Bartholomew's, Samuel Thornton had transcribed every word of Whitmore's confession, encoding it in the cipher his uncle had taught him. The young man's handwriting was precise as he recorded details that would soon become weapons. Catherine Mills, indentured servant at the Brass Lantern Tavern in Annapolis. Contract holder Jonathan Pierce. Relationship ongoing since November 1734. Whitmore plans to purchase indenture within the month. The transformation of this sacred confession into an instrument of blackmail began exactly 1 week later. Father Thornton requested a private meeting with Whitmore, claiming he needed to discuss a matter of urgent spiritual importance. They met in the priest's study on a Thursday evening, the room lit only by candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls lined with theological texts. "Richard," Father Thornton began, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed genuine, "I've been praying extensively about our conversation last week, and God has revealed to me a path forward that might ease your burden." Whitmore leaned forward eagerly, his face reflecting hope that his spiritual advisor had found a solution to his moral crisis. "The church has significant expenses coming in the next few months," Father Thornton continued. "We're planning to expand our charitable works, perhaps establish a fund to help indentured servants in difficult situations, young women particularly who find themselves in vulnerable circumstances." The priest's pause was perfectly calculated, allowing the implications to sink in before he continued. "I believe God is calling you to make a substantial contribution to this fund, perhaps £50 initially with monthly donations of £10 thereafter. This would demonstrate the sincerity of your repentance while helping others who might find themselves in situations similar to Miss Mills." The color drained from Whitmore's face as he realized what had just happened. Father Thornton had not only retained every detail of his confession but was now using that sacred information to demand money. The priest's benevolent expression never wavered, But Whitmore could see something cold and calculating in those blue eyes. "Father, our conversation was under the seal of confession," Whitmore stammered. "It should remain so." Father Thornton replied smoothly, "I would never violate that sacred trust. But God speaks to me in many ways, Richard. Sometimes through prayer, sometimes through divine revelation. He has revealed to me your desire to help young Catherine. And I'm simply offering you a sanctified way to channel that charitable impulse." Whitmore sat in stunned silence, his merchant's mind quickly calculating the implications. £50 was a substantial sum, but manageable. £10 monthly would be more difficult, but not impossible. The alternative, having his affair exposed, would destroy his marriage, his business relationships, and his standing in the community. "And if I were to contribute to this charitable fund?" Whitmore asked cautiously. "Then I believe God would bless your discretion in all your personal matters," Father Thornton replied. "The church has always been a sanctuary for those seeking to live righteous lives away from the prying eyes of gossips and busybodies." Whitmore agreed to make the payments, telling himself that he was indeed performing an act of charity that might help other young women in difficult circumstances. He had no way of knowing that he was the first of what would eventually become hundreds of victims, or that his confession had been the test case for a blackmail system that would spread across Maryland like a plague. That night, as Whitmore walked home through Havenwood's quiet streets, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February wind. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life had fundamentally changed, that he had crossed some invisible threshold from which there would be no return. Behind him, the bell tower of St. Bartholomew's rose against the star-filled sky like a dark finger pointing toward heaven, or perhaps somewhere else entirely. The success of the Whitmore blackmail convinced Father Thornton that his system was not only viable but potentially far more profitable than he had initially imagined. Over the following months, he began implementing the second phase of his plan, a systematic expansion that would eventually transform the religious landscape of colonial Maryland into his personal criminal empire. The key to this expansion lay in Father Thornton's two nephews, both of whom had been carefully groomed for their roles in the family business. Marcus, the elder at 28, possessed the technical skills needed to construct the modified confessionals, while Samuel, barely 21, had been trained since childhood in the art of transcription and codemaking. But what made the Thornton scheme truly diabolical was that both young men were legitimately ordained priests, having completed their seminary education in Baltimore under their uncle's guidance and financial support. By the spring of 1735, Father Thornton had secured appointments for his nephews at 2 additional parishes. Marcus was assigned to St. Michael's in the port town of Easton, while Samuel took over the struggling parish of St. Joseph's in the tobacco-growing region near Chestertown. Each appointment came with the same request: permission to install new confessional booths to better serve their congregations. The expansion strategy was methodical and patient. Rather than attempting to blackmail every parishioner who confessed a secret, the Thorntons focused on what they termed productive sins, transgressions committed by individuals with both the wealth to pay substantial sums and the social standing that made exposure genuinely devastating. Adultery was ideal, but they also targeted embezzlement, tax evasion, illegal business practices, and the various forms of corruption that were endemic to colonial commerce. Their system of communication was as sophisticated as their confessional modifications. Using a network of merchant contacts and traveling salesmen, the 3 priests maintained regular correspondence through coded letters that appeared to discuss routine church business but actually contained detailed intelligence about potential victims and their vulnerabilities. A letter describing a spiritual awakening among the tobacco farmers might actually be reporting that several plantation owners had confessed to cheating on their taxes. A request for additional prayer books for the Women's Society could be coded instructions for which wealthy widow had confessed to an affair with her overseer. By the end of 1735, the Thornton network was generating substantial income from 12 regular victims across 3 parishes. Richard Whitmore remained their most reliable source, his monthly payments having increased to £15 as Father Thornton claimed the church's charitable needs had grown. But the Whitmore case had also taught the Thorntons an important lesson about managing their victims' psychology. Rather than simply demanding payment in exchange for silence, Father Thornton had developed a sophisticated justification system that allowed his victims to maintain their self-respect while paying extortion. The money was always framed as charitable donations, as penance payments, or as contributions to specific church projects. Victims were encouraged to see themselves as generous benefactors rather than blackmail targets, a psychological manipulation that reduced the likelihood of rebellion or desperate actions. The system's effectiveness was demonstrated most clearly in the case of Edmund Curthis, the wealthy plantation owner whose shipping business dominated much of the Chesapeake Bay trade. Curthis had confessed to systematically underreporting his cargo manifests to avoid paying the full customs duties required by the Crown, a practice that, while common, was technically treason and punishable by the seizure of all his assets. When Father Thornton approached Curthis about making a substantial contribution to the church's mission among the poor, the plantation owner initially resisted. But the priest's gentle reminder that God sees all our commercial dealings, even those conducted in the shadows of the customs house, was sufficient to secure Curthis' cooperation. Within 6 months, Curthis was contributing £25 monthly to what he believed was a fund to help impoverished Catholic families throughout Maryland. The psychological toll on their victims became apparent as the months passed. Richard Whitmore, once known for his jovial demeanor and social confidence, became increasingly withdrawn and anxious. He began attending Mass daily rather than weekly, as if excessive piety might somehow balance the scales of his guilt. His wife Margaret noticed the change but attributed it to business pressures and her husband's deepening religious devotion. Edmund Curthis developed different symptoms. Always a meticulous record keeper, he became obsessed with his business documents, spending hours each evening reviewing manifests and correspondence as if searching for evidence of some mistake or oversight. His slaves reported that he would sometimes wake in the middle of the night and insist on personally inspecting cargo loads that had already been checked multiple times. But the most disturbing transformation occurred in the parishes themselves. The Thornton priests had created an atmosphere of spiritual intensity that bordered on the fanatical. Their sermons focused heavily on themes of hidden sin, on divine punishment, and on the necessity of complete honesty before God. They encouraged frequent confession, sometimes suggesting that parishioners who went more than a week without confessing their sins were risking eternal damnation. This spiritual pressure created a feedback loop that fed directly into the blackmail system. Parishioners terrified of harboring unconfessed sins began confessing not only their major transgressions but also minor indiscretions, inappropriate thoughts, and business dealings that might not have been entirely ethical. The Thorntons' confession records grew thick with intelligence about colonial Maryland's elite, creating a comprehensive database of secrets that would have been invaluable to any criminal organization. By early 1736, Father Thornton was ready to implement the third phase of his plan, a dramatic expansion that would extend his network throughout Maryland and potentially into neighboring colonies. He had identified 16 additional parishes where his methods could be implemented. And he had begun recruiting additional family members and trusted associates, who could be trained to operate confession recording systems. But the expansion would require overcoming a significant obstacle. The Catholic Church's hierarchy in Baltimore had begun to notice the unusual construction projects being undertaken by the Thornton priests. Bishop Carroll had specifically questioned the need for such elaborate confessional installations in relatively small parishes, and there were rumors that he was considering conducting formal inspections of churches where new confessionals had been installed. The solution Father Thornton devised would prove to be both his greatest triumph and the beginning of his ultimate downfall. It involved a level of corruption so profound that it would eventually threaten the very foundations of Catholic authority in colonial Maryland, and it would require the Thorntons to cross a line from which there could be no return. The winter of 1736 brought an unexpected crisis that would test the Thornton network's resilience and reveal the true depths of their commitment to their criminal enterprise. A young woman named Isabella Ashford, daughter of one of Havenwood's most prominent Catholic families, had begun to suspect that something was fundamentally wrong with the confessions she was making at St. Bartholomew's. Isabella was 19, possessed of the kind of sharp intelligence that colonial society typically wasted on women but couldn't entirely suppress. She had been educated by private tutors, spoke fluent French and Latin, and had developed an almost scholarly interest in Catholic theology through her extensive reading of her father's religious texts. This education would prove to be Father Thornton's first serious miscalculation. The previous autumn, Isabella had confessed to Father Thornton that she had been secretly reading books that the church considered inappropriate for unmarried women, specifically several philosophical treatises that questioned traditional religious authority. It was a minor transgression by colonial standards, but Father Thornton had recognized an opportunity to establish control over the Ashford family fortune. Within 2 weeks of her confession, Isabella noticed that Father Thornton had begun incorporating specific references to young women who contaminate their minds with dangerous ideas into his Sunday sermons. When he requested a private meeting with her father to discuss concerns about the spiritual welfare of young people in the parish, Isabella's suspicions crystallized into something approaching certainty. But Isabella Ashford was not content to simply suspect. She was determined to investigate. Using skills she had developed through years of scholarly research, Isabella began conducting a systematic analysis of Father Thornton's behavior patterns. She noted which parishioners were called for private meetings with the priest and attempted to correlate these meetings with their previous confessions. She paid attention to which families had suddenly increased their charitable donations to the church and tried to identify what they might have confessed that would inspire such generosity. Most importantly, Isabella began testing her theory through carefully controlled experiments. She confessed different fabricated sins to Father Thornton, claiming she had stolen small items from local merchants, pretending she had entertained improper thoughts about married men, even inventing a story about secretly reading Protestant religious texts borrowed from Anglican neighbors. In each case, Isabella watched carefully for signs that Father Thornton was using her confessions to manipulate her family's behavior. When she confessed to borrowing a silk handkerchief from Whitmore's general store, Father Thornton's next sermon included pointed references to those who take what doesn't belong to them, even in small matters. When she invented a romantic interest in a married tobacco merchant, the priest began counseling her father about the importance of finding Isabella a suitable husband before her natural feminine weaknesses led her into temptation. But the experiment that convinced Isabella she was dealing with something far more sinister involved a deliberate lie about her family's business practices. She confessed to Father Thornton that she had overheard her father discussing plans to avoid paying customs duties on a shipment of European goods by falsely declaring the cargo as religious materials exempt from taxation. This confession was pure fiction. Isabella's father was scrupulously honest in his business dealings, but within days, Father Thornton had requested a private meeting with James Ashford to discuss the spiritual implications of certain business practices that might compromise a man's standing before God. Isabella realized with growing horror that Father Thornton was systematically using sacred confessions to blackmail his parishioners. But her investigation also revealed something even more disturbing. The scope of the operation appeared to extend far beyond St. Bartholomew's parish. Through discreet inquiries among her social connections in Annapolis and Baltimore, Isabella discovered that several other Catholic parishes had recently installed elaborate new confessional booths. When she mentioned the names of the priests involved, Marcus and Samuel Thornton, a pattern began to emerge that suggested a coordinated criminal enterprise operating under the cover of religious authority. Armed with this intelligence, Isabella made a decision that would have been unthinkable for most colonial women. She decided to confront Father Thornton directly. She requested a private meeting under the pretense of seeking spiritual guidance about her upcoming engagement to Jonathan Pierce, a young merchant from Annapolis whom her parents had selected as a suitable husband. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in late February 1737 in Father Thornton's study adjacent to the church sanctuary. Father Thornton received Isabella with his usual display of paternal warmth, offering her tea and expressing his pleasure at her family's happiness about the engagement. But Isabella had not come for pleasantries. "Father Thornton," she began, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was about to say, "I have reason to believe that you have been violating the sacred seal of confession for purposes of financial extortion." The priest's benevolent expression never wavered, but Isabella noticed a subtle change in his posture, a slight tensing that suggested her accusation had hit its mark. "My dear child," Father Thornton replied with gentle concern, "I fear that your upcoming marriage, and the natural anxieties it brings, may be causing you to have troubled thoughts. Perhaps we should discuss these concerns in the context of confession, where I can offer you proper spiritual guidance." "I have no intention of confessing anything to you," Isabella responded firmly. "Instead, I want you to explain why your sermons consistently reference the specific sins that parishioners have confessed to you privately. I want you to explain why families who confess certain types of transgressions subsequently receive requests for increased charitable donations. And I want you to explain the unusual construction of your confessional booths. Father Thornton's mask of benevolent concern finally slipped, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. When he spoke again, his voice carried a subtle threat that Isabella recognized as confirmation of her worst fears. Miss Ashford, I fear you have developed some very dangerous ideas. The kind of ideas that could cause great distress to your family if they became widely known. Perhaps it would be wise for you to focus on preparing for your marriage and leave theological matters to those with proper training. Isabella stood to leave, but Father Thornton's next words stopped her at the door. I trust that this conversation will remain between us. Your family has such a sterling reputation in this community. It would be tragic if that reputation were to be damaged by unfounded accusations against a servant of God. As Isabella walked home through Havenwood's dark streets, she realized that she had not only confirmed her suspicions about Father Thornton's criminal activities but had also made herself a target. The priest's final words had been a clear threat: cooperate with his schemes or face consequences that could destroy her family's social standing. But Isabella Ashford had not spent years studying philosophy and theology only to be intimidated by a corrupt priest. She had a plan that would either expose the Thornton network or result in her own destruction. And she was prepared to accept either outcome in service of justice. Isabella's plan required resources, required allies, and required a level of discretion that would challenge even her considerable intelligence. She had identified the crime, confirmed the method, and confronted one of the perpetrators. Now, she needed proof that would convince the Catholic Church's hierarchy to take action against the Thornton network, and she needed that proof before Father Thornton could implement whatever retaliation he was planning. The key to gathering evidence lay in gaining access to the basement chamber beneath St. Bartholomew's, where she suspected the confession recording system was located. Isabella had studied the church's architecture during years of regular attendance, and she had noticed several anomalies that now took on sinister significance. A door in the basement that was always kept locked, unusual acoustic properties in the nave that suggested hidden chambers, and the fact that Father Thornton often disappeared for extended periods during times when no services were scheduled. Her opportunity came during the annual Lenten retreat in March 1737, when most of the parish would be attending special services at the cathedral in Annapolis. Father Thornton had announced that St. Bartholomew's would be closed for cleaning and maintenance during the 3-day retreat, providing Isabella with the access she needed to conduct her investigation. But first, she needed to neutralize the risk that Father Thornton might discover her activities and implement his threatened retaliation against her family. Isabella's solution demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that would have impressed military commanders of the era. She composed a detailed letter documenting her suspicions about the Thornton network, including specific examples of correlations between confessions and subsequent sermons, the unusual construction of the confessional booths, and Father Thornton's implicit threats during their private meeting. She made multiple copies of this letter and arranged for them to be delivered to Bishop Carroll in Baltimore, to the Governor of Maryland, and to her cousin Thomas Ashford, who served as a magistrate in Annapolis, in the event that anything should happen to her. The letters were held by a trusted family servant with instructions to deliver them immediately if Isabella failed to retrieve them by a specific date or if any harm befell her or her family. This dead man's switch effectively neutralized Father Thornton's ability to retaliate against her without triggering a full investigation of his activities. With this protection in place, Isabella proceeded with her infiltration of St. Bartholomew's basement during the second night of the Lenten retreat. She had obtained keys to the church through her friendship with Margaret Whitmore, who served as the church's volunteer caretaker and had access to the building for cleaning purposes. What Isabella discovered in the basement exceeded even her worst expectations. The locked chamber beneath the confessional area had been converted into an elaborate intelligence-gathering operation. The walls were lined with metal tubes that fed sound from the confessionals above, and a sophisticated system of curved metal reflectors amplified conversations to crystal clarity. But most damning were the hundreds of coded documents that filled several wooden cabinets, transcripts of confessions dating back nearly 3 years, organized by parish and cross-referenced by the names of the confessors. Isabella spent several hours examining these documents, her horror growing as she realized the scope of the Thornton network's activities. The files contained not only transcripts of confessions but also detailed profiles of victims, records of blackmail payments, and correspondence between the three Thornton priests discussing the expansion of their operation to additional parishes throughout Maryland and into Virginia. One file, marked with symbols she didn't recognize, contained what appeared to be a list of parishioners who had somehow become problematic for the network. Isabella's blood ran cold as she realized that several of these individuals had died under mysterious circumstances over the past 2 years, deaths that had been attributed to natural causes but which the coded document suggested might have been something else entirely. But the most disturbing discovery was a detailed plan for what the Thorntons called their final solution, a systematic expansion of their blackmail network that would eventually encompass every Catholic parish in the Chesapeake region, creating a criminal enterprise capable of controlling the economic and political life of the entire colony. As Isabella carefully copied key documents using a camera obscura technique she had learned from her scientific studies, she heard sounds from the main floor of the church that made her blood freeze. Father Thornton had returned early from the retreat, and she could hear his footsteps moving purposefully toward the basement stairs. Isabella barely had time to extinguish her candle and hide behind one of the filing cabinets before Father Thornton entered the chamber. Through a gap between the cabinets, she watched as the priest moved with the familiarity of long practice, checking the recording tubes and examining recent transcript files. But then he did something that confirmed Isabella's worst fears about the Thornton network's methods. From a locked drawer in one of the cabinets, Father Thornton withdrew a small glass vial containing a white powder. Isabella watched in horror as he carefully measured a portion of the powder into a separate container, then sealed both vials and returned them to their hiding place. Even in the dim candlelight, Isabella recognized the substance from her studies of chemistry and medicine: arsenic, the poison that had become known as inheritance powder for its effectiveness in removing inconvenient relatives. Father Thornton spent nearly an hour in the basement chamber, reviewing files and making notes in his coded journal. When he finally left, locking the chamber door behind him, Isabella remained hidden for another hour before daring to emerge from her concealment. Her investigation had not only confirmed the existence of the blackmail network but had revealed something far more sinister. The Thorntons were prepared to commit murder to protect their criminal enterprise. The following morning, Isabella retrieved her letters from the servant and added additional pages documenting her basement discoveries, including detailed descriptions of the poison she had witnessed Father Thornton handling. She then faced a terrible decision: should she wait to gather additional evidence that might ensure the Thorntons' conviction, or should she trigger the investigation immediately to prevent potential murders? The decision was made for her when she learned that Richard Whitmore had fallen violently ill after taking communion at Sunday Mass, exhibiting symptoms that perfectly matched arsenic poisoning. As Whitmore lay dying in his home, attended by a physician who attributed his condition to a sudden fever of unknown origin, Isabella realized that the Thornton network had begun eliminating witnesses who might pose a threat to their operation. She had less than 24 hours to expose the conspiracy before more victims joined Whitmore in the grave. But the Thorntons had been operating their network for nearly 3 years, and they had contingency plans that Isabella was only beginning to understand. When she awoke the next morning to find 2 men watching her house from across the street, she realized that her own life was now in immediate danger. The final confrontation between Isabella Ashford and the Thornton network would test not only her courage and intelligence but also her willingness to sacrifice everything, including her own life, to prevent a criminal conspiracy from achieving complete control over colonial Maryland's Catholic population. The morning of March 15, 1737, dawned gray and cold over Havenwood, with a fog rolling in from the Chesapeake Bay that seemed to muffle sound and blur the boundaries between earth and sky. Isabella Ashford stood at her bedroom window, watching the 2 men who had maintained their surveillance of her house throughout the night, their breath visible in the cold air as they pretended to engage in casual conversation while never taking their eyes off the Ashford residence. Richard Whitmore had died during the night, his final hours marked by the agonizing symptoms of arsenic poisoning that the local physician, Dr. Benjamin Crawford, had misdiagnosed as putrid fever. Isabella knew that Whitmore's death was both a message and a declaration of war. The Thorntons were prepared to kill anyone who threatened their operation, and she would be next unless she acted immediately. But Isabella had spent the sleepless night preparing for this confrontation, and she had devised a plan that would either destroy the Thornton network or expose their crimes so publicly that even their deaths couldn't silence the truth. The key to her plan lay in exploiting the one weakness she had identified in their operation: their arrogance and their absolute confidence that colonial society would never believe accusations made by a young woman against respected priests. At 8 that morning, Isabella walked calmly out of her house and directly toward the two men who had been watching her. Their surprise at her bold approach gave her the few seconds she needed to speak before they could react. "Please inform Father Thornton that Miss Ashford requests an immediate meeting to discuss her recent spiritual concerns," she said in a voice loud enough to be heard by several neighbors who were beginning their morning activities. "Tell him that I have some documents that I believe will be of great interest to him and that I'm prepared to discuss terms for their return." The men exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to respond to this unexpected development. After a brief, whispered conference, one of them nodded and headed toward St. Bartholomew's, while the other maintained his watch on Isabella. Father Thornton's response came within the hour. He would meet with Isabella at 2 that afternoon in the church sanctuary, ostensibly to provide spiritual counseling for her grief over Richard Whitmore's death. The meeting location was perfect for Isabella's purposes. The sanctuary's excellent acoustics would ensure that her conversation with Father Thornton could be heard clearly by witnesses she had positioned throughout the church. Those witnesses included her cousin Thomas Ashford, the magistrate from Annapolis, who had arrived that morning in response to Isabella's urgent message; Dr. Benjamin Crawford, who was still puzzled by the unusual symptoms he had observed in Richard Whitmore; and Margaret Whitmore, who had agreed to help Isabella despite her own grief because she suspected that her husband's death was connected to his mysterious monthly payments to the church. But Isabella's most important witness was Bishop Carroll himself, who had traveled from Baltimore after receiving Isabella's detailed letter about the Thornton network. The bishop had initially been skeptical of accusations made against 3 of his priests, but Isabella's evidence had been compelling enough to warrant a personal investigation. At exactly 2 o'clock, Isabella entered St. Bartholomew's sanctuary to find Father Thornton waiting for her at the altar, his usual benevolent expression replaced by something cold and predatory. The afternoon light filtering through the church's plain windows cast long shadows across the pews, creating an atmosphere that seemed more suitable for a trial than a spiritual counseling session. "Miss Ashford," Father Thornton began, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary, "I understand you have some concerns about certain church matters that you'd like to discuss." "Indeed, I do, Father," Isabella replied, positioning herself so that her voice would project to the hidden witnesses. "I've discovered that you and your nephews have been operating a criminal conspiracy that violates the sacred seal of confession and uses religious authority to commit extortion and murder." Father Thornton's mask of priestly concern finally fell away completely, revealing the calculating criminal beneath. "Those are very serious accusations, Miss Ashford. I hope you have substantial evidence to support such claims." "I have transcripts of recorded confessions from your basement chamber," Isabella replied, producing a folder of documents. "I have coded correspondence between you and your nephews discussing blackmail payments and the expansion of your network to 16 additional parishes. And I have witnessed you handling arsenic in the same basement where Richard Whitmore's confession was recorded. The same Richard Whitmore who died last night with symptoms of arsenic poisoning." Father Thornton's eyes narrowed as he realized the extent of Isabella's knowledge. "Miss Ashford, you have stumbled into matters far beyond your understanding. The work we do serves a higher purpose than your simple mind can comprehend." "Enlighten me, Father," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the danger she knew she was facing. "Explain to me how blackmailing your parishioners and poisoning those who threaten to expose you serves God's purpose." Father Thornton stepped closer, his imposing height casting a shadow over Isabella. "The Catholic Church in Maryland exists at the pleasure of Protestant authorities who would destroy us at the first opportunity. We have created a system that ensures the survival and prosperity of our faith by securing the loyalty of our most influential members. Those who contribute generously to our cause receive our protection. Those who threaten our mission face the consequences of their betrayal." "You mean those who refuse to pay your extortion demands are murdered?" Isabella said bluntly. "I mean that God works through his servants in mysterious ways," Father Thornton replied. Richard Whitmore had become unreliable. He was beginning to ask questions, demanding to see how his charitable contributions were being used. He represented a threat to our entire operation. Isabella felt a chill as she realized that Father Thornton was essentially confessing to murder, apparently confident that she would not live to repeat his words. But what he didn't know was that every word was being heard by Bishop Carroll and the other witnesses hidden throughout the sanctuary. "And what about me, Father?" Isabella asked. "Am I also a threat to your operation?" Father Thornton's smile was genuinely terrifying. "Miss Ashford, you are an unmarried young woman making hysterical accusations against respected priests. Who would believe such claims? Even if you were to make these allegations publicly, they would be dismissed as the fantasies of a disturbed mind. But fortunately for both of us, that won't be necessary because you're going to voluntarily withdraw these ridiculous accusations and destroy whatever evidence you think you've gathered. Because you intend to kill me as well? Because we know about your late-night activities in our basement," Father Thornton said. "We know that you violated the sanctity of God's house to steal church documents. More importantly, we have witnesses who will testify that they saw you in Richard Whitmore's house on the night he died. And we have evidence that you possessed arsenic for your chemical experiments." Isabella felt the trap closing around her as she realized the sophistication of the Thorntons' contingency planning. They had anticipated the possibility of exposure and prepared to frame her for Whitmore's murder. "Even if you were to avoid prosecution for murder," Father Thornton continued, "the scandal would destroy your family's reputation. Your father's business relationships would evaporate. Your engagement to Jonathan Pierce would be terminated, and your family would be ostracized from decent society. All of this can be avoided if you simply admit that your accusations were the product of feminine hysteria and emotional distress following Whitmore's death." "And if I refuse?" Father Thornton's expression became genuinely sorrowful, as if he regretted what he was about to say. "Then I'm afraid you'll be found in your room tomorrow morning, having taken your own life in remorse for falsely accusing innocent priests, and for your guilt over murdering poor Richard Whitmore. Suicide is a mortal sin, of course, but God is merciful to those whose minds have been disturbed by their own wickedness." Isabella realized that this was the moment of ultimate test, not just of her courage, but of her faith in justice and her willingness to sacrifice herself to prevent greater evil. Father Thornton had revealed the full extent of his network's corruption and his willingness to commit murder, but only because he was confident that she would never live to expose him. "You've made one critical mistake, Father Thornton," Isabella said, her voice ringing clearly through the sanctuary. "You've assumed that I came here alone and unprepared." Father Thornton's confidence wavered slightly as Isabella raised her voice to address the hidden witnesses. "Bishop Carroll, Magistrate Ashford, Dr. Crawford, I trust you.